Okay, welcome back to week 5. So this week we are going to focus on human learning in more general. Last week we talked about the children's L1 acquisition and how that can inform our L2 learning process. This week we are going a little bit broader, I guess, so thinking about human learning in general, somewhat reviewing what we have talked about so far, but advancing in a way that we can learn more about human learning. So with that said, let's begin, and we are going to go ahead with our slide. So before you begin, I think it would be nice for you to take some time to just choose one of the three major perspectives on learning and discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of the perspective in more detail. Try to fill them out. I don't know how much you're ready yet, but take some time to figure it out. Try to jot them down before we actually begin our week 5 lesson. When it's over, we are going to come back to it. So I hope you have some time to sit down and write down some of your thoughts or some of the strengths and weaknesses that the book describes. So what I'm going to do is we are going to come back to this idea this coming Wednesday at the very beginning of the class, and we'll be able to check some of the strengths and weaknesses that we have offline. So we are going to move ahead for now. So let's move on to the next slide. So we are going to talk about some of these different perspectives. The first one, behavioral, the second one, cognitive, and the third one, social constructivist. So some of you can remember what we have so far been talking about, some of the perspectives that we have looked at before. So today we are going to start off with, again, behavioral perspectives and how those perspectives came to be so important in the field of language learning. So let's first take a look at a very short clip and try to take a look at what type of information that we'd be able to gain and why this is somewhat amusing. So let's take a look at the video. Okay. The video, and we'll talk about it together.
When you feel the first signs of a cold, use Vicks First Defense. It's a new microgel that attacks the cold virus before it has a chance to turn nasty. New Vicks First Defense. Attack is the best form of defense.
Okay, so this was somewhat comical, but let me stop.
Failure marketing with Base 44 Super 8.
Go back. So what do you think was somewhat comical in this particular commercial? Does anyone want to share what you thought or how it resembles what we often think usually happens? Or if you were able to read about behavioral perspectives beforehand, do you think some of the things that came out in the reading might be relevant here? Okay, so I wanted to ask you guys, when you were young, were your parents the kinds who let you buy what you wanted to have? Or do you think you had a hard time trying to persuade them why you need to get it? I think my case was the latter too. I feel like I have never had any experience of getting, like, for example, like cotton candy when we go to amusement parks, for example. We used to have, like, during big national holidays in South Korea a long time ago. I think nowadays too, some people do it. But during the Chuseok, for example, or like New Year's Eve, New Year's, we often went to the cemetery to visit. You make a visit to your like your ancestors, for example, and because a lot of people did that, there were a lot of junk foods that were lined. I mean, they were waiting for you almost, and from the entry point to where you're going. And I remember, like, they were selling balloons. I don't know how balloon has anything to do with New Year's or your ancestors, but they had balloons, they had cotton candies, all these junk foods too. And I remember asking my mom to get it for me, but that never worked. And I think after repeating those experiences, I started not asking for it because I knew that she was never going to get it for me. It was similar to like toys, for example, unnecessary toys, I guess. And that brings us back to the memory of how we are somewhat trained in a way to understand what might happen or what might not be. And that's somewhat closely connected to this idea of behavioral perspective, how we are somewhat trained with the responses that we get. So, what's going to happen or what's going to be accepted by the other person? If my mom, in fact, said yes to everything that I did, probably I might have asked for like not only cotton candy, but also like for like balloons and stuff and all sorts. So that's my behavior is pretty much determined by what I have experienced previously. And that's somewhat closely connected to what we say related to behavioral perspectives. So you can, in fact, from the commercial that we just saw, we can find a child like screaming in a supermarket, asking his or her mother to buy him or her a toy, for example. Or even, for example, you can think that you go to school and somebody gives you a compliment on your outfit or on your makeup, for example. That gives you an idea. Okay, so it seems like this thing works, right? So the next time that when you go on a blind date and if you want to make a good impression, then you might throw in the what was it, the outfit that you got compliments about and go to the date. So these are the ideas that we can make association between our daily life to the what was it, the behavioral perspective that we are going to soon talk about. So it's like you do something and you get something as a return. Okay, so that's the basic idea related to behavior perspective. Can anyone think about any other examples? I think one thing could be like, for example, you speed or you do something like speeding, and then what happens? So to live in a society, when you speed, then you get a fine. You have to pay the fine for it, right? And then you will remember that if, okay, so next time if I don't want to pay fine, and also not only that for that reason, but I should not speed. So these are another example of how we can find this perspective related to behaviorism in our daily life. So try to think about these that are not really isolated from our daily life. It's actually very closely connected to our general learning. It's not only language learning, but also learning in general, learning to become a citizen in our society, successfully functioning in it too. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So we are going to now start more discussing about Pavlov's classical behaviorism to start off with. I think you guys probably have heard about Pavlov before, right? I think it's quite, hold on, a mess. Oh, okay. Um, it's quite common nowadays to read at these like novel or not only novel, nonfiction, where we talk about Pavlov and the Russian psychologist. So Ivan Pavlov, who is a Russian psychologist who came up with this idea of behaviorism. Can anyone remember what this experiment was about? Yeah?
He was feeding the dogs with meat, ringing the bell, and the dogs had an association between the bell and the feeding time. So next time he rang the bell, they were salivating.
Yes, absolutely right. So he had this experiment with a dog, as Anel just mentioned, by thinking about how a dog would salivate by this idea of classical conditioning. So he thought that this learning process consisted of this idea of association between the stimuli and the reflexive responses. We also now know that these responses can be derived from these type of unconditioned stimulus somewhat automatically and at the same time indirectly. So this idea of classical conditioning started to evolve afterwards that we are going to soon talk about as well. but it essentially means that there are going to be these unconditioned stimulus, and then the responses comes afterwards, and that becomes conditioned response. So something that would happen with not intentionally, very indirectly or naturally, and then there are these responses that are associated with it. And when it's stuck, then it becomes conditioned response. So the dog would salivate when they hear the bell, right? Even without seeing the food. So in this idea, learning in general is occurred through the process of conditioning. So that was the argument that was made in under the House of Behaviorism. So we build an array of stimulus response connections. So we start building these connections in our mind, and more complex behaviors are learned by building series of chains of responses. So it could start off with a simple connection between 1 and 2, the stimulus and response. But then when the behaviors itself become more complex, it becomes a series of the chains of responses that are connected together. So Thorndike's law of effect is a very closely connected one, where the stimuli that occur after takes place after behavior influence future behavior. So this particular idea somewhat paves the way for another psychologist who, in fact, somewhat challenged the Pavlov's classical conditioning behaviorism called Skinner to modify our understanding of human learning. So we are going to now gradually move on to another person who is a very famous figure called Skinner. So in this case, Skinner called Pavlov's theory the respondent conditioning, because behavior was elicited by only a preceding stimulus. So what this challenge was that Pavlov's theory was that there should always be, just let me quickly go back, there should always be a stimulus and then response. And then through that interaction, conditional response occurs. So what Skinner pointed out was that there always seems to be, in Pavlov's theory, the stimulus that precedes any type of response. So stimulus seems to be the core idea in Pavlov's understanding of behaviorism. However, Skinner was pointing that out, that it might actually not be. So Skinner, coming from the United States, also is a very famous behaviorist. And he added this dimension to psychology about how there could, in fact, be something called operant behavior. So operant behavior refers to behavior in which one operates on the environment. So some of the examples would be, we cannot really identify specific stimulus that leads a baby to rise to a standing position or take a first step. We don't necessarily have the baby with a particular stimulus to, let's say, start their first word or stand up or take a first step. So all these examples suggest that this operant behavior is the behavior in which one operates on this particular environment. So it's not really the focus on the stimulus, but rather we focus on the consequences. So not a stimulus that starts off with like a bell, for example, but it's more like the consequences that comes afterwards. So in the idea of Skinner and conditioning, operant here refers to the classes of responses that are emitted and also governed by the consequences that they produce. And in this, some of the terms that come up are the respondent also, which refers to classes of passive responses that are elicited by identifiable stimuli. So reflecting the physical reflex actions, for example. Some of the key principles that come out is this idea of reinforcement that strengthens behavior, while punishment is generally avoided in this case. So understood under the House of Skinner's conditioning and operant behavior and all these concepts has to do with this idea that reinforcement is important, but in this case, punishment, like for example, paying the fine in this case, might be understood to be generally avoided in the Skinner's understanding of language learning behavior. So Skinner, in fact, believed related to punishment. Skinner, in fact, believed that punishment was not really positive. It did not really do much work for the advantages. So it was more of a disadvantage to both the child and the parents. So when we're talking about language, not only language learning, but also for learning in general, under Skinner's conditioning, this idea of punishment was generally avoided because it was not really doing good under that. But he also said that this very active reinforcement, like saying like good, right? Good boy, or good job, or yes, excellent. All these type of active reinforcement can make somewhat the extinction work faster, and also faster than the absence of any type of reinforcement. So not having any reinforcement was better. I think that would be an easier way to understand it. Reinforcement of a positive thing would go better than producing something that was more negative, for example, the punishment in this case. So Skinner and Pavlov's theory is slightly different, although they do come from both this idea of behaviorist perspective. So you can see how they are somewhat interacting with one another, having different perspectives, but slightly moving away from one another as well. So while the behavioral perspective and also the theory that we have just learned about is somewhat relevant to what we have so far been talking about, we are going to next move on to the cognitive perspectives. So we are going to take a look at some of the rote learnings, for example, and also the Ausubel's cognitive theory of learning in more detail. And if you were able to read the book, that's great. But if you haven't done so, please try to, while you're in a small breakout room, try to discuss what you think that the cognitive theory of learning could be understood as either the rote learning or the meaningful learning, or which one you think is better and which one poses different challenges. So let me put you guys into small breakout rooms, and I will bring you guys back in about 4 minutes, and we'll talk about these two questions. Okay, so it seems like everyone's back, so we are going to move on with our discussion now. I think I forgot to talk about the relationship between behavioral perspectives to language learning, more specifically. So I'm going to come back to it very soon. But let's first go ahead with the discussion questions. What are some examples of rote learning that you think you did? Theo?
I think there are some examples like memorizing the multiplications, like 5 times 4 equals 20 and 6 times 9 equals like 54 or something like that. I think especially in Korea, we all became the master of rote learning from the elementary school, I think.
Yeah, Theo, when did you learn multiplication, or when did you memorize it?
I actually cannot remember because it was so long time ago, but I think it was the second grade of my elementary school, or third grade, I think.
Me too.
Yeah.
When I came back to Korea, I was in second grade. I was just put into second grade. By the way, I did not go to the first grade. I just jumped to second grade. So I have no first grade. So second grade, as soon as I started my class in Korea, I very vividly remember that moment because my dad thought that I had to memorize multiplication before I went to school. Otherwise, I don't know. He thought that it would be a horrible future for me, I guess. I don't know. So he put me into my room and said that until I memorized the whole multiplication, I could not leave the room. I could not come out. And I still remember that moment. I was so stressed out. I was like, why? What are these numbers? And I still try to memorize it. So I think multiplication is an excellent example of rote learning, right? Because we can't really assign any meaning attached to it. It would be very hard to like understand it from the very start unless you rote memorize and rote do the rote learning. Very good. So what do you guys think about the difference between the two, rote learning and meaningful learning? Or which one do you think is better? Or do you think, like, I think going back to Theo, do you think memorizing the multiplication rules was useless? Or what do you think? What do you
Actually, when it uh, comes to like with meaningful learning or like rote learning, I think actually, in my opinion, meaningful learning is indeed more better, I think, but also I think meaningful learning is really meaningful when and only when rote learning in the basic level is complete, I think. Because by rote learning, without understanding something, but I learn anyway, we can build up some basis on our understanding and some application skills, I think. So uh, meaningful learning is more high level and more, I think, intelligent thing, I think, but it's only meaningful when also rote learning is done.
Mhm. Very interesting. I think Theo just emphasized the relationship between the two, that they could both offer us how they are somewhat codependent on one another, right? So I think that's an interesting point related to rote learning and meaningful learning. A lot of the times people do assume that the rote learning is not really good and meaningful learning is the best way to go. I mean, that would be very ideal, but in some cases, as Theo just mentioned, sometimes rote learning does happen. For example, do you guys remember your phone numbers? Right? Do you guys remember your address? All these are not really that meaningful to you, but that is very crucial to have those memorization done so that you can go home, you can remember to, you don't necessarily call yourself, but you can give your number to somebody so that they'd be able to call you. So these are all these types of rote learning that we do. Before, I mean, you guys are very used to having cell phones around you. But before cell phones were the usual item in our life, I think we all memorized our friends' numbers. I still remember my best friend's numbers when she was her house number. The when now like 20 no 30 years ago, I still remember them because it was rote learned, but I used it so much that it just stayed with me. Also car plates, right? All these simple rote learning that we still do. And also, but at the same time, meaningful learning, people often say that they could stay longer because it's meaningful. But that does not necessarily mean that it's not going to be forgotten. So even though you think that these meaningful learning is going to make a greater influence in your lifelong journey, but it might actually be forgotten as well. So it's actually both. So some of the things that we learn, like phone numbers or zip codes and such. And at the same time, we also have some meaningful learning that are done. So very good points. So moving on to, I think some of you guys have talked about something similar. Moving on to more specifically on David Osbald's idea of meaningful learning theory, we are going to look at learning in a little bit of a different way, where we look at learning that occurs when new information is connected to existing knowledge. So this is the part where Theo just talked about how it seems like meaningful learning could happen when it is connected to something that has happened before. These existing knowledge could actually be learned meaningfully, or it could actually be rote learned. It does not really matter. But in meaningful learning theory, it looks at the learning that takes place in our human organism through a very meaningful process of relating, making connection between the new events or things or items to something that already exists. So that's the idea originally with the meaningful learning theory. So in this way, rote learning, it includes memorizing information with almost little connection to prior knowledge. So that has to do with rote learning, remembering the zip code of our highest university, for example, or the number of your lab, for instance. All these rote learning is somewhat has not really much of a connection to prior knowledge, but meaningful learning is integrating new information into something existing that is already existing, that is described as a process of making connection, relating the new items to something that already has been established. So meaningful learning seems to promote deeper understanding and long-term retention. So it seems to be relying on the long-term memory. But as I mentioned before, it is likely, but not always. So we are going to go into one of them each. I think some of you might have heard about it or memorized it before, in addition to the multiplication rules. The rote learning is the process of acquiring isolated blocks of information with no particular function and building a structure and no relationship to other blocks. So I don't know if some of you guys might be unfamiliar with this, like 태정태세 문단세. Has anyone heard of this before? So this is to remember not the acronym, the first word of the king's name in the Joseon dynasty. So this is how we remember who came first, who's the son of whom, and who, yeah. So to understand the Joseon dynasty history and who was the king during that particular time, this is the order of remembering them. So this is the type of rote learning, right? It has no meaning in itself. We in fact use the rhythm to remember, and rhymes sometimes, but essentially it does not necessarily contain any meaningful blocks. Does anyone know this idea of my very educated mother just served us noodles? Do you guys know what this stands for? It's similar.
The order of the planets, I think.
Yes, the planets. Yes. So this is to remember the order of the planets. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and such. So again, this is a type of rote learning, right? Where as you can tell, around the world, everyone is trying to make the best effort or trying to find an effective way to remember things that seems to be irrelevant to the previous existing knowledge. So these are the types of rote learning items that I wanted to share with you guys. So in this case, the rote learning, we can find the acquisition and storage of items as arbitrary entities. What we mean by arbitrary is that it seems to be somewhat not really meaningful, that they seems to be like an arbitrary science, for instance. So in this case, inefficient retention because of interfering contingent items. What this means is that they are not really connected tightly to one another. So it's much more easier for one to lose the memory of those items that we remembered without any repeated conditioning. The reason why repeated conditioning comes out is because try to remember how you learned or how you memorized the multiplication rules without repetition constantly, and it is more likely to lose that memory. Like if you, let's say that you move to a new apartment next year or in a couple of years, then it's your memory of the current zip code would slightly fade away, right? Unless you keep repeating it or unless you stay in the same zone that you use the same zip code. So this is the idea related to retention, unless you have a very, very good, excellent memory that I expect that a lot of you do have, but still it's going to, our brain is going to tell that whether this is a necessary or important information or not, and then lose some of them. On the other hand, we have meaningful learning, where meaningful learning is the process whereby new blocks of information become an integral, a crucial part of already established categories or systematic clusters of knowledge. What this means is you have an existing information that you can make connection to. So therefore, it becomes meaningful afterwards. So you have an acquisition and storage of items anchored to an already establish conceptual hierarchy by subsumptions. So here you already have an existing one, but through the subsumption process, it's going to be somewhat tightly connected in retention. And afterwards, we do talk about, however, something called systematic forgetting very soon, where it is going to be pruned. You know, guys know what pruning is. Like a tree should be pruned, usually during summer, not summer, spring, right? So they are pruned or winter or spring to make a larger, more global consumption. So we are going to soon move on to the systematic forgetting, but beforehand, the meaningful learning examples. Again, the example of light ice. Do you guys know what light ice means? So the first time I went to the States, I went to Starbucks, and I don't like to put a lot of ice in my coffee. So I usually went for, how would you use the expression to say that not a lot of ice? I mean, you can say not a lot of ice, please, but I went for less ice, right? Because I thought like less would be better than usual. And then soon afterwards, I saw the other person using the expression light ice. Oh, you mean light ice? And so when that person spoke the word light ice, you start to make connection. Oh, ice, that is light. Altogether is describing a state of light ice, which means that not like less ice than the usual. So then in that case, you already have this idea of light and ice in your brain, that they become meaningfully connected in this particular circumstance, that afterwards you'd be able to use it. So I'm pretty sure that you can find a lot of these examples where we are making connection between what we already know and what we are able to make connection to, the new information. So that's what the meaningful learning essentially refers to, where we are talking about the subsumption too. It's almost like the same expression where we refer to this process of relating, and here it talks about anchoring this new material to something that is relevant or that seems to be already established. So that's the idea of subsumption in the meaningful learning process. So going more specifically to Ausubel's definition of rote learning, then, rote learning, Ausubel describes that it is as the process of acquiring material as discrete and relatively isolated entities that are relatable to cognitive structure only in an arbitrary and verbatim fashion, not permitting the establishment of relationships. So here, this idea of this discrete and relatively isolated entities becomes quite important, that could be used to relate to the already established cognitive structure. But this idea is something, again, not concrete, but it's an arbitrary concept. So that's the idea related to rote learning that Ausubel described. So in Ausubel's definition, rote learning involves this mental storage of items having little or no association with existing cognitive structure. So you can imagine the opposite of this description refers to meaningful learning, right? So there's no establishment of any relationship in the Ausubel's understanding of rote learning, but the meaningful learning is the other way around. So when we take a look at meaningful learning, also called as subsumption, may be described as the process of relating or anchoring new material to relevant established entities in the cognitive structure. As this new material enter our cognitive field, it suddenly interacts with and also is appropriately subsumed under a more inclusive conceptual system. So you'll be able to make connection between what we already know. So it comes in and it starts making these connections when they are more meaningful. Because this particular material is subsumable and also relatable, the same thing, to stable elements in the cognitive structure, it becomes meaningful. So can you guys make a guess of what this SALD means?
Sale?
Yeah, very good, Anel. So what gave you that idea?
minus 50% often like the first say asal.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. So I went to like, I think this idea came to my mind like, wow, like 10 years ago or something. When I first went to Italy, I don't know Italian that much, or only know cafe, I guess, but an espresso. Um, so I was walking the street. I don't know any Italian, but I was looking at the store and it was July. So everything was on sale. And I did not understand the word sale, what sale was in Italian, but on the showcase, they have this huge word saldi, which starts with S also, and it was all in red. So it makes you wonder what that means. And you use your pre-existing knowledge saying like, oh, usually we also have sale, right? Or I mean, we use the discount, for example, as you just mentioned. And also the it seems like it's on a rack, for instance. All this idea suggests that although you don't know Italian, it makes connection, and you can say that this could mean sale, right? So the use of your pre-existing knowledge to make sense of the new information coming in, that could in fact be more meaningful. So in fact, so the words only, I don't know how to even pronounce it. Does anyone know Italian here? No? Okay, so that means it's fine for me to pronounce it any way I will like, and you won't be able to judge me. So I don't even know the word. I think it might be Saudi. I don't know. But in this case, not even knowing how to pronounce it, but still it becomes somewhat meaningful to my own sense because it relies on my pre-existing knowledge. So that could be an example of meaningful learning. So going more into the distinction between the two, the difference between the two is that at first, they may not be that important to talk about the distinction since it seems like either one could be learned, right? So the rote learning and also the meaningful learning, at the end of the day, they be able to both learn from it. So it seems like, why do we need to know that, right? Why do we need to know about the difference between the two? However, the significance of this distinction becomes somewhat clear when we are talking about the memory, the retention, basically, whether it stays or not. Human beings are capable of learning almost anything. That is the reason why we can learn or we can memorize our phone numbers. We can memorize the zip code or you can memorize the passcode, right? So we can learn and memorize anything, but the difference between the two has to do with what stays longer. For example, we can remember an unfamiliar phone number long enough to dial it, but over time, it is usually forgotten, right? So I think that's one, and this becomes very true once you get older, by the way, coming to you guys very soon too. But a long time ago, I remember like, I could remember or memorize like long phone numbers or long numbers in a sequence, but nowadays it's like getting shorter and shorter, I feel. But anyways, so rote learning becomes more distinct, I guess, to myself. That's a sad story. So basically, it again has to do with this idea of memory. And right before in the previous slides, we talked about something called systematic memory, systematic forgetting as well. Before we move ahead with systematic forgetting in more detail, let me show you a short clip so that we'd be able to talk about the memory, the way that we remember things. So let me show you a clip from Sherlock.
Perfectly all right.
But maybe it's not a drug.
No, it has to be a drug. How did it get into our systems? How?
There must be something buried deep.
Get out.
What?
Get out. I need to go to my mind palace.
The what?
He's not going to be doing much talking for a while. We may as well go.
His what?
Oh, his mind palace. It's a memory technique, a sort of mental map. You plot a map with a location. It doesn't have to be a real place and then you deposit memories there. Theoretically, you can never forget anything. All you have to do is find your way back to it.
So this imaginary location could be anything, a house or a street?
Yeah.
This is a palace. He said it was a palace.
Yeah, well, it would, wouldn't it?
You ain't nothing. Count.
Okay, so what we just looked at, I mean, sometimes this is almost sort of a television show. So it was a way to let us know how this character, Sherlock, remembers things. Does it seem familiar to the way that you think or you remember things? You know, how do you guys remember things? Or have you thought about how you remember stuff? Well, this is definitely a visualization of our memory, I guess, how people remember things. And I think that was a television show which showed us like this is the way that it traces back to what Sherlock came to find out about in this particular episode. But oftentimes it's not really a map. I mean, the who was I think Watson also says something like it's not really a location, but this is a way that you can remember things and endlessly, and this where you be able to go to these places. So I think the message here was pretty much closely connected to the meaningful learning because it was pointing out the relationship, how we can go back and trace and it stays longer as much as you'd like. So that's I think the idea of meaningful learning was a little bit more emphasized, although Sherlock is very, very good at remembering things in the character. So that will be slightly different. But when you think about your own learning experiences, not only limited to language learning, why do you think that we forget things in general, or in language learning, or in learning in general? Why do you think we forget things? Or what do you think are some of the things that we can easily forget?
Some detailed things, I think.
Details? Hero, I didn't really get the first part. What did you say?
Yes. Sorry, my internet is today so funky. So I think some easy things to forget is when it becomes more detailed, I think it is easier to forget generally.
Oh, so something that is very specific and detail rather than,
Yes, yes.
okay. I think that could be one. Yes. Anything else?
For me, okay, okay.
No, 승모,
You go first.
승모, 정수, and
You go first.
Okay.
Okay. So I thought fundamentally the total amount of information we can actually memorize is constrained, kind of. So, well, that's different by people. There are some people who can memorize a lot in a short time, but in my case, it was really constrained. So that can be limited. Mhm.
the quantity, right? So the quantity also seems to matter. And depending on the quantity, we can't really necessarily memorize every single thing. And therefore, we have to probably come up with the idea of prioritizing, right? Which one seems to be more important compared to others, right? Good. 정수?
For me, I think I usually forget information that don't seem really important to me. So, for example, when I start for a military, I had a chance to like memorize the manuals of using the program, but after I forget everything because it is not really meaningful for me.
Yes. So when we think about the meaningfulness of which one is very important, like how long it stays also, I think that could also be driving whether it stays or not. I just remembered that what year are we in? 2026. 2026. So 20 almost 5 years ago. No. Hold on, 26. So 20 years ago, around 20 years ago. I think I told you guys that I shortly worked in Samsung Electronics, and we had to memorize the name of the panels, the LCD panels at that point, and we were selling it basically, right, to other global companies. And I still have those codes in my head. So when Tongsu was just talking, I was like, yeah, I have like it's like LTN 121 W1 dash DO1 dash one. And it's like it stays with me. And I'm like, I can't lose this information, right? But it's like I think I've been exposed to it long enough that it just stuck with me. And it was very important to memorize all of those. I think that's why. So it's an interesting point about the importance, right? Good. And now?
Yeah, I pretty much fully agree with Jongsu. That's what I wanted to say. Like the importance and also whether or not this information is interesting to you personally. Like I always had trouble with history lessons because like first they're not relevant. We're in our own time, right? And second of all, they're incredibly boring, so never memorize that.
Oh my God, I think people who are majoring in history would be devastated hearing that.
Luckily, no people like that at KAIST.
I agree with you in some way, like too. Because only when I started to visit those places, for example, or museums, for instance, or learning about it from their point of view, that became very meaningful to me too. I think I had a hard time actually memorizing the historical events and the years and stuff before actually going to those places or looking or learning about the stories that became more relevant to me. So nowadays I really like watching those history channels because now it's like more relevant to me in a way because I've been to those places. But I think I get where you're coming from, like not making those connections, making it relevant. It seems still like a part of rote learning. Good. Yeah. Chunyoung, do you want to add something?
Actually, I think information of exam is suddenly gone after the exam. Yeah.
That is so true. I think, why do you think that happens? I think the reason why I laughed was because I think I had the same experience when I was a student. Like until you take the midterm exam, everything stays with you intact, and then suddenly right after when you're leaving, it's just gone. So it seems like, oh, that's an interesting point. I think we should start thinking about. I think that's a sad one too, because it probably means that it was not that meaningful. And I hope you guys don't have that experience 2 weeks from now. But and I think that's one of the reasons why I think I constantly ask you guys to make connection with the examples or some of the experiences that you had, because I feel like that meaningfulness could come from your own experiences, right? Yeah. So that's a sad story, but in fact a true one. So it was a very interesting one. So how do we try to retain information? So I think the answer is not the answer. I think we can go about it in two different ways. When we're talking about the rote learning information, how do we try to retain those information? I think with my case, the LTN 121 W1, that case, I think I just kept repeating it and also kept using it, right? Every single day for more than a year would actually just stay with you long enough, right? Also, I think like the example, like 태정태대 문단세, for example, right? We can actually put those into rhymes or rhythm, right? So if rhythm stays with you, you'll be able to remember it a little bit longer, right? Any other idea that you want to share, or is it your big secret that you don't want to reveal so that other people can remember things as much as you do? Anything that you do, or anything that you've tried?
I just wanted to share, do you know mnemonics?
Mnemonic.
Mnemonics? Yes, so I think it's very similar to like keeping some information in rhyme, for example, like the about the planets. So, and you just come up with those little rhymes or associations to make it easier for you to remember something. I actually try to study mnemonics to like enhance my, I don't know, studying abilities, but I don't think it's that useful. Like maybe only for rote learning, it can enhance your memorization, but for other stuff, like I don't know, I don't think it would work for example, your major courses.
Yes. So what Anel just talked about, I think the examples that we've seen, like my very educated mother just served us noodles. So those could be the example of mnemonics that Anel just described about making connections, somewhat using the rhymes and stuff, using these different letters and associating it with it. So that would be called the mnemonics. Good. But as Anel just mentioned, it would be somewhat difficult to do that when we are talking about something that is very important, or to think about the meaningful ideas, the meaningful information now. So I think that gives us a really nice way to turn to our next slide, where we are going to now talk about systematic forgetting. Why do you think we have this idea of systematic forgetting? Any thoughts?
It implies that we don't just forget something randomly. We do have kind of system.
Yes, it's not something that we randomly forget. I mean, when we start randomly forgetting, we might need to go to the hospital, but we are talking about systematic forgetting, where we are forgetting things in a way that are not, it starts with unnecessary things usually. So it's systematic. It's not just random, right? So David Othwell provided this explanation for this idea of forgetting. Why do we forget things? What do we forget about? So when we talk about inhibition usually is something that usually comes in between, where our memory is influenced by these inhibitions which we call either proactive or retroactive inhibition. So when we are rote learning, basically, our memory is influenced by these two. When we talk about the first one, for instance, since rotely learned materials do not substantially interact with our existing cognitive structure, they are learned through the loss of association. And in this case, retention is influenced primarily by interfering effects of similar materials learned immediately before the learning task, which is called the proactive inhibition, or something that we learn right afterwards, which is called retroactive inhibition. So we cannot say, of course, that meaningfully learned material is never forgotten. Even though something was very meaningful to you, we do forget. Let's say that you had your first love and you went out for the first time and you remember the date, for example, when you first started dating. 30 years from now, when you actually meet your husband or wife, for example, those dates might not stay with you. So these are some of the things that suggest that even though the meaningfully learned ideas would not really stay forever. However, in such learning, forgetting occurs in a very purposeful manner because it is a continuation of a process of subsumption. So this idea of how we are losing or we are forgetting things are not just by chance, but it is systematic. We eliminate from our cognitive structures, our cognitive field, by eliminating first the unnecessary items first. So it is very intentional, interactional, and purposeful. This idea of cognitive pruning comes out. I hope you guys remember this. Like pruning is the idea of eliminating, right? Cognitive pruning refers to getting rid of unnecessary cognitive cluster first, clearing the way. But for what the purpose for this is, that comes right after. We have to provide space for new material to enter our cognitive structure. So it would be nice to explore all the brain, the capability we already have, but for human beings, usually we go through this something called cognitive pruning, making room for the new information to come in by getting rid of the unnecessary ones. So it's somewhat natural for people to go through the cognitive pruning. And moving on to the next part. Okay, so we have a lot of these key items when we talk about cognitive perspectives. The first one has to do with language attrition. Language attrition refers to the loss or decline of language ability over time. So we lose the ability to talk or to remember the words, for example, and possible causes could include neuro-linguistic blocking, motivational factors, and cultural identity shifts. You might, for example, this might just refer to people who just grow old and losing their ability in the linguistic sense. But not only that, I think I talked about my own expression before about how we could speak one language when you're young. Let's say when you were 5 years old, I could speak Dutch. But since I was not really motivated to continue on the learning process, I stopped and then it no longer stays with me. So the language attrition talks about this loss, so complete loss or decline. So it could happen because people get old or people just lose contact with the community that uses those language. So language attrition is another item that comes out in cognitive perspective. We just lose them. Subtractive bilingualism is another idea that comes out when learning a second language leads to the gradual loss of the first language. So this is different from compound bilingualism or the coordinate bilingualism that we talked about, right? The subtractive bilingualism, subtracting means minus, right? Subtractive bilingualism is when you learn the L2 and L2 becomes too big of a part in your life, that L1 is gradually gone. So that's what subtractive bilingualism refers to. Similarly, first language acquisition refers to native language forgetting. So that might occur when learners increasingly rely on a second language, which eventually begins to replace the first language in daily use. So this one is particularly focusing more on the bilingualism idea, and the first language acquisition refers to the removal of the first language. So these two are somewhat overlapping. I think that's the way that you can look at it. Subtractive bilingualism refers to the bilingualism sense, but subtracting the L1, the first language acquisition more specifically focuses on the removal, the loss of L1. So when we go through all this, the implications for learning in general points to the initial learning process as should involve systematic and meaningful subsumption of material in order to enhance the long-term retention. Could be one thought that we can come up with after going through the cognitive perspectives. And also another point is while rote learning may be effective in the short term, it often fails in the long term because of the accumulation of interference from similar materials that we just talked about in the systematic forgetting. When we are exposed to similar items and also the interference that comes before and after, we talked about the inhibition that comes proactive and retroactive inhibitions. From those, the rote learning might actually be much harder to remember it in long term. Okay, so we are going to stop here. Next class, we are going to come back to social constructivist perspective and also go back to each one of them, making connection to learning and more specifically, language learning. So I'm going to stop here. And if you have any questions, please stay and ask me before you leave. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, everyone, and I will see you guys next class.